Okay, so this is the history of the Bible, and we're going to be talking about how this book, that of course we use so much, came from its original state to where it is today. And what we're hoping to arrive at is what Mr. Comfort says in his book, that the Christian can take the whole Bible in his hand and say without fear or hesitation that he holds in it the true Word of God, handed down without essential loss from generation to generation throughout the centuries. Now, that's a bold statement, and I'm going to attempt to establish the truth of what he has to say. And some of the key terms in there we will be focusing on, like essential loss, and we're going to be talking about that generation to generation transmission of that information. So as we go, we are endeavoring to answer these questions. What does our faith, the Christian faith, require of the Bible? What do we need it to be? Right? What is it? What does it have to have as an inherent quality to be what we need it to be? So what we need it to be is an accurate reproduction of what was originally written. And that, of course, is a paramount question. Is what we have today an accurate representation of what Moses and David and Jeremiah and Luke and Paul and all the rest wrote? Right? Very important question, and that we're going to focus on that as the first thing. That's going to be the primary focus of tonight's session. And is it written in a language and verbiage that the reader can understand? Doesn't do us any good if we can't understand it. Right? In this case, for most of us, that means it needs to be in English, in a form of English that is accurate and understandable. Now, whether or not those originals written by those men so many years ago are the Word of God is a matter of faith, right? That's a theological discussion. We can't establish that with historical evidence. Right? We can establish whether or not the Apostle Paul wrote this thing, but we can't establish whether or not God was working through the Apostle Paul to write that thing. That's not a historical fact. That's a matter of faith. Okay? What we do with it is discipleship. When you read what Paul wrote, that's not something we establish from history, but then you have to figure out with your church and your church leadership and fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, what do I do with this? Jesus said this, what am I supposed to do? Right? Paul wrote this, what am I supposed to do? And the question, however, though, the question of how well it is preserved, whether or not it is those original writings and how well it's translated, that is a question of history, and that is something that we actually can answer, and with a great deal of certainty. So we're going to take a look at that and focus in on these two things. The Bible's history from its original writing to today is a story of copying and translating. Okay? Copying from one handwritten manuscript to another handwritten manuscript in the same language. This was done for most of the Bible's history. The last 500 years, of course, we've got the printing press, right? And that's a whole new aspect of the game, and we'll talk about that when we get way up in there to the 1500s. But before that, it was always, as everything was in the ancient world, handwritten. Okay? You've got one copy and you're copying another, right? That was the only way to get it done. They didn't have any way to reproduce copies other than by hand. Now, we know this, we inherently know this about history, right? But sometimes that doesn't sink in, because our whole lives are photocopies, and well, if you're old enough, the mimeograph before that, and now you can simply just take a picture of anything on your phone and have an accurate rendering, right? But that's not what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about handwritten copies. And so when we talk about them, we've got some interesting questions that pop up. Number one is, how old is the copy that we're talking about? Is it from the 300s, the 700s, the 1200s? How old is that copy? The older, the better. And what condition is it in? We'll look at some examples of some fragments that history has not been kind to. All right, pieces are missing, pages are missing, that kind of question. And of course, how accurate was that copying done? I've toyed with the notion over the years for this seminar of doing a hand-written copying thing just to prove to yourself that you can't copy that well either. But I think we could all figure that out. If you were to copy the entire book of Luke by hand, you would make mistakes. You would. Now, if you were trying to be a smart aleck and say, well, I won't make any mistakes and I will go super slow and just look, right? And I won't make any, you probably still would. But you'd be a little bit better off. But that's not the way, of course, the average copy was made. It had to get done, right? This is a very expensive process. So we want to talk about how old they are, about what condition they're in, and how accurate they are. When we get to the section on translating, which of course, we can't be talking about that in the original state. We can't be talking about that in the ancient world because, of course, we're talking about the Bible in English, and there is no English language in the time of the Apostle Paul. All right, we'll talk about when it comes into be once we get to that part of history, but that's 1,000 years after the time of Christ. When we're talking about translations, we first off need to make sure it's comprehensible, right? Can the person reading it or listening to it in their language, the person who speaks that language, can they understand it? If they can't understand it, it's not a very good translation. Is it accurate? When you translate, you are saying, what is the word in this new language for the word that was being used here? How do I make this phrase equal that phrase? How do I make this idea, this thought? And we'll look at some of those when we get to the modern translations, and I'll show you some examples. And then, of course, there's a question of whether or not the translator or the translation team has any kind of bias or agenda. Were they trying to slant the translation to prove their particular viewpoint? So every Bible in existence today, in every language, of course, except for if you're reading it in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew or in ancient Greek, which most of the people in the world are not, every other Bible is a story of copying and translating. They're all about copying. Most of them, of course, are about translating as well. Let's make sure that you understand this particular point. No original autographs, and that's what we call the handwritten copy from the author, right? When Paul wrote Romans, when Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, that's the autograph. No autograph of any ancient document exists. Nothing written by Plato, nothing written by Caesar, nothing written by Confucius. No ancient document in any language, in any culture, still exists. That is the original autograph, and the Bible is no exception to that. Any ancient document must therefore be the result of copying by hand. We have no originals of things written by hand. It's just not the way it works. But the only thing that would be an asterisk to that would be something that was carved in stone that has survived. All right, but nobody carved in stone the entire Bible on stone. That would have taken a long time. So we come to this question. Does a miracle of inspiration require a miracle of preservation? If we believe that it is the Word of God, that God is behind the authorship, and of course there's different theories of inspiration, but if we posit that God is the author of this document, did God have to preserve it miraculously as well? Because that is the only way that the original autographs would still exist today, is if it was a miracle. Because no ancient document has that. And there is an interesting convergence on this between skeptics, and in this case an apostate like Bart Ehrman, who's written a lot of books over the years about the unreliability in his mind of our modern scriptures. He believes that if God did not preserve the document perfectly, he must not have had any authorship in it anyway. And that's the same thing that the more fanatical King James only people believe as well. I pointed that out in a post some years ago, and a King James only advocate responded to that. Wasn't too happy that I said, you guys agree on this, but they do. Actually, a very fruitful conversation with this gentleman, hashing out some of these issues. But if you believe that it has to be a perfectly preserved text, then you're left with one of those two kinds of explanations. Either we have no text at all, and that's what Bart Ehrman would say. It can't be the Word of God. It's not reliable because it's got flaws. And the King James only people would say, yes, that has flaws, but our 1611 in English is perfect. They're just moving the goalpost and saying we can score here, mixing my metaphors. But no ancient document contains perfect copying. It's just not possible. Okay? There's an interesting parallel in Islam. All right? Islam teaches that the Quran is a perfect copy of an eternally existent document, all right, that was copied perfectly. The third caliph, leader of Islam, a man named Uthman, burned all the source material, leaving only one master text. So no one can go back and say whether or not what we have today is what Muhammad wrote, because generations after his death, all of the evidence of the original autographs that were still, of course, in the 7th century, 8th century, still around, were destroyed. Not a useful thing for us, and we are certainly grateful that that's not the case with the Hebrew and Greek text of the Old Testament and the New Testament that we have to work with here. Questions at this point? Yes?
When you're saying original autographs, you just mean the original text written by that person?
The text written by that person. We use autograph to usually talk about someone's like their head, right, on a baseball. But the autograph means what Paul wrote with his own hand, or his amanuensis wrote, or whatever. The original first copy is the autograph. And none of those still exist. We'll get into some of the reasons why in a little bit, but you can imagine, at the least, it's been nearly 2,000 years on the short end of the time scale. That's a long time. So let's talk about the text that we have. And that means we need to talk about variance. A variant is when you have one handwritten copy and another handwritten copy, and they don't agree at some point. You're looking at the two of them, yep. Oh, wait a minute. We got two different words here. Or we have this one's singular and that one's plural or whatever, right? There's a difference. That difference between the two manuscripts is called a variant. Now, this is an important point as well. There was never a time when any one man, in contrast with Islam, or group of men, or whoever you want to call them, had control over the whole text of the New Testament. We're primarily talking in this discussion about the New Testament in Greek, not the Old Testament in Hebrew. That's a separate history. But nobody ever had it all. There's a very important reason why, right? Each book of the New Testament was written by in a different time, in a different place, and by many different authors. They were not deposited in some library in Jerusalem or whatever, right? When Luke finished the Gospel of Luke, he didn't hand it over to whoever for safekeeping. All right? That's not the way it worked. All the books of the New Testament were never in the same place all at once. Think about that, and it makes all the sense in the world, right? They were never in the same place. Therefore, if you were to come out and say, well, the New Testament used to say this, but they changed it. They changed it. They is a great boogeyman. They changed it. They got all the copies together, and they changed them all. And actually, Bart Ehrman has made this part of his skepticism of the New Testament to say that the original authors of the Gospels didn't believe that Jesus was God. But later on, century or and a half, 2 centuries later, they changed it. But there's no they. And even if they had wanted to, they didn't have access to it. Because when these copies were made, they were sent off. New copies were made and they were sent off. All right? So if you say that the church, right, whoever your person is that you're worried about, the church, they added this or they subtracted that, it's just not possible because they never had control of the text. So we don't have to trust that they had perfect motives and ability, because there is no they. New Testament manuscripts were copied with multiple intersecting lines of transmission, and I'll explain that. There was no opportunity to edit them all. So in other words, the Gospel of Mark, we'll pick one, right? The Gospel of Mark is written, and then a couple more copies are made of that original autograph. And they're sent, one to Antioch, one to Alexandria, and one to Ephesus. When they get to those three locations, more copies are made of each of those second generation, right? The original is the first generation. The copy from that original is the second generation. They get to these new locations, and people copy them from there. And then the one that was in Alexandria, now there's 4, and they're sent out to 4 different spots. And the one that was in Antioch, maybe they made 5 copies, and they're sent to 5 different spots. All of a sudden, we've got a spider web of copies going around the Roman world and beyond that nobody has control over. This is being done as one at a time as people need them, right? People want them. People have the ability to make the copies. And so they're going everywhere. And think of all the different pieces of the New Testament having having their history spreading out in every direction. You couldn't possibly have, in the 2nd century or the 3rd century, when the church starts to get organized enough and have bishops and have, right, the Nicene Creed and the councils, you couldn't possibly have gone out and said, give me all the copies of the Gospel of Mark so I can add the deity of Christ. Because it wouldn't have worked. Right? They would have missed many of them, and we would have found one in the desert that reads just like the Gospel of Mark, except for all of that supernatural stuff about Jesus wasn't in it. And we'd be like, what? Right? But that's not the way it worked. That's not the way history works. It makes for a good Dan Brown-style novel, right, with a villain, like in his crazy books, but that's just not the way history works. And certainly not with the New Testament. So nobody edited them all. That is not something, that is a complete red herring. You may see it on a YouTube video, or you may see it posted on social media, somebody arguing about they added this or they subtracted that. It's just not true. Let's keep going. Variance and textual control. We were talking about textual control, but I haven't talked about variance yet. What about the disagreements? And this is an analogy that I think will help us. Like an 1,000-piece puzzle, it's not that we have 375 pieces of the New Testament. There are not gaps in the New Testament text that need to be filled in. Okay? Like most ancient texts. That happens all the time with ancient texts. Plato, Cicero, there are pages missing or pieces missing, and nobody knows what was in that gap. And it has to be supplied by the historian, right? It says, well, I think the end of this sentence says this. We don't have that with the New Testament. What we have is 1,100 pieces. And wouldn't you like to do that puzzle? 1,000-piece puzzle with 100 extra pieces that don't go anywhere. That would just be mean. Don't do that to someone. But that means that our text is fuller than was original. It's got extra in it. And so the question is weeding out what is extra. This is a quote from Kurt Aland, a very famous historian of the text. The transmission of the New Testament textual tradition is characterized by an extremely impressive degree of tenacity. Once a reading occurs, it will persist with obstinacy. I will explain that with a chart on the next page. It's precisely the overwhelming mass of the New Testament textual tradition which provides an assurance of certainty in establishing the original text. So Kurt Aland is saying that once a variant occurs in a copy, it doesn't go away, it doesn't disappear. It sticks around once someone makes a mistake in their copying. Let me show you how that works. This isn't the most high techie chart, but it's the best one that I was able to find. So we've got the original manuscript, the autograph at the top, right? And in this particular verse, it says, the only Son of God at this point in our text. Obviously, that's the English. It's not what it would say in the Greek. But we're making it helpful for all of us. In the second generation, they made 4 copies, and the 2 that survived were correct. We guess that they made 4 copies. Of course, we don't know the copies that don't exist, right? If they've disintegrated, burned, flooded, destroyed, we don't know because they don't exist. We can't count what's not there. But let's assume there were more, and those we don't have anymore. But the 2 in the second generation were just fine. And those 2 became 5. But one of them forgot the word only. Sloppy. Made a mistake. It happens. All right? Rather than disappearing in that 3rd century, 3rd generation document, it actually keeps getting copied in the 4th and 5th. And so it grows over time. A variant in the text, if it's early enough in the text, 3rd century, 4th century, will become quite popular by the time you get to the 11th, 12th, 13th century, because it's being copied and copied and copied. Right? These all have their own history, each of these copying lines of transmission. Every once in a while, we have evidence that a copyist, right, had 2 different ones sitting in front of him, and he used those to make his copy. But most of the time, they're copying off of just one. So if you're a monk in the 7th century, sitting in a scriptorium copying by candlelight, you are working from the one copy of the Gospel of Mark, we'll just keep using Mark, that you have in front of you. And what it says is what you copy. And if it has a mistake, unless you've got the Gospel of Mark memorized and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, I'm going to stop and try to figure that out, you're just going to copy that error again. And so these errors, these variants, they stick around. Which leads to this, and this is the part that might blow your mind for just a minute, but wait until we get to the end of it because it's not what it seems. There are 400,000 approximately variants in the New Testament manuscripts. You look at all the copies, the hand copies that have survived to this day, there's 400,000 differences. Now, if this was a social media meme, we would just say, oh my goodness, there's only 138,162 words in the New Testament. More variants than words. Does that mean that each word has 3 possible choices? That when the translators sit down, they're saying, eeny, meeny, miny for every single word? No. Because 99% of the variants don't impact the meaning of the text. If one monk spells one of those names that when it's your turn to read in church and you look and say, uh-oh, right? If one monk can't spell that name the correct way, that's a variant. But it doesn't change the meaning when you misspell words, right? You can usually tell what the word was supposed to be. Spelling word order, getting the words in the wrong order, using a synonym instead of the original. And this one is quite common. It's called the Greek movable nu, which doesn't mean anything to you, but that's okay. It's the difference between a car and an apple. If I say a apple or an car, it's a variant. If I was doing this in English, it doesn't change the meaning, right? It's bad grammar, but it doesn't change the meaning. So in order to be significant, a variant must be both viable and meaningful. So viable means that there has to be evidence to show that it's original. Remember our chart with all of those copies, right? If we found one variant in a 11th century copy, and that's the only manuscript that it's in, that one and the ones from the 12th and 13th century, it's never been seen from any copy earlier than the 11th century. 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, none of those copies have this. That's not viable. That's not original. We know it's not original because for the first 11 centuries, it wasn't in the text. Somebody made a mistake, and it ended up getting copied. We can write that one off. Yes, it's a variant, but it's not viable. Nobody, no historian, no expert in the text thinks that that's a legitimate option for the original text. And at the same time, it has to be meaningful. So if it doesn't impact the meaning, if it's just spelling or word order or an error that is obvious and correctable, then no, it's not going to be important. Which leaves us with 1% of those 400,000 variants that are both meaningful and viable. If it couldn't have been original, we can set it aside. If it doesn't affect the text meaning, we can set it aside. But if it's both, it might have been original and it does affect the meaning, that's 1% of those. About 2.9%, or once every 3 pages more or less. So about 1 time every 3 pages, there is a variant that could be the original text that affects the meaning. If you look at one of your modern Bibles with the textual apparatus in it, right, that has the little notes at the bottom, and it will say, or this, that's a textual variant. That the translators said that variant is viable enough and meaningful enough that I should put it in the bottom so that people can think about it. The one they put in the text is the one that they believe to be original. Okay? Long story short, the other one is less likely in their mind. Okay? There are 2 main Greek texts that are used for the translations today. They don't agree on everything, but those are typically in your notes, in your scriptures there. And so when you see one of those, now you know what that means. That means that there are enough copies that are old enough that the translators believe this might be the actual text. Okay? Most of the time, the difference between what's up there and what's down here is not that significant either, but it's a slightly different meaning, and so you need to be aware of it. Only half of the meaningful variants are viable, resulting in 1,500 viable and meaningful variants. So we started with 400,000. And that was kind of a scary number. Now we're down to 1,500 that could be original and affect the meaning. Let's pause for a minute and see if we're on the same page there. Do you understand that? I'm not trying to dismiss the fact that there are variants. That's not a problem. All right? That is the natural result of handwritten copies. It really can't be any other way. Let's look at some conclusions about this, and then we'll pause. This is Bart Ehrman. This is from one of his books. Or actually, I'm sorry, this was from I think this one was from a debate that he did, and I had to listen to it about 8 times to get it exactly quoted properly. So he said this guy doesn't believe that the text we have is from God because it's got all of these errors in it, but this is what he says. To be sure, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes, that's that 400,000 we talked about, found among our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant, immaterial, of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes couldn't spell or keep focused any better than the rest of us. So one of the greatest skeptics of our generation says that the vast majority of the variants don't mean anything. Scribes couldn't spell either. They got distracted. They did a lot of these. There's a lot of these that you can find in them. They're reading one line, and because it ends in a certain way, when their eye goes back, they're skipping, and they skip a line. They skip a line all the time. Or they repeat something like because you're going from one end back, right? You're going to make those kind of mistakes. They left lines out. It was common kind of thing. But when they do that, it's not that hard to see, right? Because you're looking at it and say, wait a minute. I see what you did. You made that kind of mistake. Happens. And this is important. The more manuscripts you have, the more variants exist. If there is one manuscript like the Quran in under the third caliph, there are no variants. There are no differences because you have nothing to compare it with, right? The one that you've got is the one that you've got. But how can you have any confidence that that is accurate? How can you know it wasn't changed? Which, of course, the Quran can't answer that. And they actually don't do scholarship about this question because it's a tenet of their faith that this is a perfect representation of the eternal Quran, and so we don't have these conversations. Christianity and Judaism do, because we recognize that this copying process is a human process, not a divine one. Okay? God was not working with the scribes to make sure that they copied perfectly. All right? If he did, we would have a very different history, right? We would have all of these manuscripts and they would all be exactly alike, and it would be pretty incredible. But that is not the will of God. He didn't choose to do that. So if we had 10 manuscripts, let's continue with the Gospel of Mark. Say we had 10 copies of the Gospel of Mark, one from the 2nd century, one from the 4th, one from the 5th, 6th, 2 from the 8th. We've got 10 copies total. There wouldn't be that many variants, right? But if we have 1,000 copies of the Gospel of Mark, we're going to have quite a few variants. The more copies, the more variants. So the large number of variants must mean there's a lot of manuscripts out there. And that is the truth. And we will get to that, and this is going to be our next thing. So let's pause a minute before we talk about how many manuscripts there are and talk about textual variants. Are you with me on this?
With all those variants
Yes.
and mistakes, how can they still call the Bible the Word of God?
Well, so a couple of reasons. We can still with confidence call it the Word of God for one of the biggest reasons is that within all of this mountain of evidence, all of these manuscripts from all of these different locations over the centuries, right? Some of them quite ancient, all the way up through the 13th, 14th century before we get to the printing press. All of that contains within it the original. It's that 1,100-piece puzzle, right? The original reading from Paul, from Luke, from James, whoever, is in there. It has some extra stuff in those variants. An extra word, an extra phrase, a missing word, a misspelled word, obviously that kind of thing, but it's in there somewhere. Because once they start appearing, they don't disappear. That would be disturbing if a reading just disappeared. Then you would wonder what happened to it. But by and large, they just keep getting copied. Because again, you've got someone in a church in North Africa, right? He's making a copy of 2 Timothy. He doesn't have access to all the other copies that are floating around Christendom at this point. He's got access to the one he's got. And so that's the one he's copying. And if it had an error or 2 or 3 in it, he's going to copy those down too. All right? Every once in a while, one of the scribes would have said, wait a minute, that's not right. And sometimes they put that in the margin, right? My copy, he'll put a little arrow and write in the margin what he remembers the text being, but he copies what was on his copy. That kind of thing is fascinating when you see them in the text. And actually, I'll show you an example of that once we get a little bit further around with one of the codices. So the fact that the readings don't disappear gives us great confidence that the further back we go, we are getting to the original. But even something from the 12th century, something from the 13th century is highly accurate in comparison to other standards. Okay? I will show you a comparison, and then this will give you some perspective. All right? We've got more to go. I've got to bring up this this web page. All of these are available there on my blog. because the PowerPoint is there and you can go ahead and look at it. I got to get, there we go. Come on, move. There we go. All right. So what about other ancient documents? You're saying there's a bunch of copies of the Bible, and we haven't even given you a number yet, but let me give you the comparison, okay? Plato. You know, you've heard of Plato, right? Probably had to read The Republic in high school, didn't you? All right, I did. Written somewhere between 427 and 347 BC. The oldest surviving copy of Plato that we have is from AD 900. That's a 1,200-year gap, and there's only 7 of them that are that old. How confident are we that that's exactly what the philosopher Plato wrote? Right? It's a little rough. Look at Herodotus, 1,300-year gap for 8 copies. Thucydides, 1,300 years. Euripides and all his plays, 1,300 years. These are single-digit copies that are 1,000 years later. Caesar, this guy's important, right? His on Gaul, he wrote about his conquest of Gaul. You got to wait 1,000 years before we have a copy of that. Now, copies were made before that, right? They were made when Caesar was alive. They were made in the years after that, but they haven't survived. They've been lost to history. Let's keep looking. We'll get a little bit better. Aristotle, kind of important guy, right? For Western philosophy, 1,400 years between when he wrote and our oldest copy. Now, there's a decent number of them, but that is a big gap. Sophocles, Homer in the Iliad is the only thing, one of the only things from the ancient world that has anything like the manuscript evidence of the New Testament. Homer's Iliad was one of the most common pieces of literature in world history. People were reciting that. Bards were memorizing it and performing it all over the Greco-Roman world for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not surprising that some copies were made. Only about a 500-year gap, and there are over 600 copies, which means a decent amount of confidence in the accuracy that this is what Homer, and of course the historians argue whether or not there actually was a Homer, but what the original story, about 95% accuracy. That's A work. That's pretty good. Look at what we got with the New Testament, and we're going to start taking a look at the examples. Less than 100 years to our oldest surviving manuscripts. Just a couple generations later, we still have them. And we've got more than 5,600. The number changes because new ones are being cataloged and found year after year. It's up over 5,800. This chart is a little bit old. But that's a 99% accuracy. So if, as Bart Ehrman is saying, we can't trust the New Testament because of its textual variance and all of that, then what can we trust from the ancient world? Absolutely nothing. Don't say anything about what Plato wrote or Aristotle or Caesar, because none of that has any validity by that standard. Let's take a look at the evidence. So, the papyri are our oldest documents, our oldest evidence. Written on papyrus, that's why they're called papyri. Many of them are fragmentary, all right? Let's stop for a minute and think about that. Why have these handwritten manuscripts not survived to the modern world? Give me a reason why a manuscript would not still be here 2,000 years later.
They dry out.
Just where, right? From the dryness or the wetness. Either they get damp and they get ruined, they get dried out and they crack and fall apart. What else? There's lots of reasons. Animal destruction, child destruction, all sorts of accidental destruction. Fire is the most common reason. How many ancient cities burned to the ground? All of them, right? How many times did London basically burn down, right? This happens again and again and again in the ancient world, and not to mention the fact that war usually results in fire and destruction, but regular old ancient world living with all of those fires and candles and lamps and stuff, those cities burn down all the time. Okay? The opposite of fire, flood. Most of the ancient world's cities are built on a river or on the coastline. Hurricanes, floods, not good for documents that are ink on papyrus or paper or vellum or whatever thing. Flood is bad. Fire, floods, earthquakes, right? Burying it under the rubble. And then, of course, you've got several spasms of the Roman Empire before Constantine of deliberate destruction, where they went house to house looking for copies to be burned. So you got fire, you got flood, you got just wearing out and not surviving. You've got deliberate destruction, you got accidental destruction. You got bugs, right, that eat these things. These little worms and whatnot that like to chew on that stuff. Plenty of those out there. So yeah, it's not surprising that few things from the ancient world written on these kinds of medium have survived. It's a wonder that any of them have. And many of our oldest ones that we have, like P52, have been found in places like Egypt, where they were put in a jar and buried in the sand kind of thing. Either they were hidden by somebody who was trying to escape persecution and they never came back because maybe they died or whatever, and we found them 1,800 years later, open up the jar, whoops, there it is, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? It survived that way. Not from northern climates, not from wetter climates, because that just doesn't happen. Okay? P52 is one of our oldest manuscripts from about AD 125, maybe only 30 years after John wrote the gospel. Of course, arguing about when John wrote the gospel is a whole other thing. Look what it has. John 18, 31 to 33 and 37 to 38. Two-sided. It's a tiny little fragment with just a couple of verses. What could that teach us? If those verses, those few words, match up with what we have from later, then that's a good sign. Right? And these guys are experts. They can look at 12 words, or partial words on a little scrap of paper and say, oh, that's John 18, right? When you do this for a living. So that's one of the oldest ones. You got P46, which is from about 150 AD. Notice it's fragmentary, right? Because it's busted up. But it's got a lot of Paul's writings, only about 60, 70 years after he wrote them. So maybe this is a third generation copy, maybe a second generation. Maybe it was even copied from the original. It's hard to say. All right? But it's pretty ancient, and it's got a lot of pieces that are going to... It's got all of Ephesians and Galatians and Philippians. I mean, it's got a lot. P66, again, the Gospel of John, a little bit longer, only 130 years after it was written. P67 is a bunch of Matthew, only 130 years after it was written. Compare that to the 800, 900, 1,000 years we were seeing with these other ancient documents. Here's what they look like. That's P52, those couple of verses, those little scraps, right? But it's invaluable. There's P90, I didn't talk about that one, but you can see, time has not been kind, right? How much is left? So the oldest documents that we have, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, they're primarily these papyri that are pretty beaten up. Okay? They were not bound in a book originally. They didn't have that protection of the binding. The book that process doesn't start for another until the 3rd century. So they are going to get torn apart. It's going to happen. It's amazing that we have the ones that we do, and we may find more. Archaeologists are always digging stuff, right? Digging in Palestine, digging in Egypt. They may come across a void underneath a building where they find a whole bunch of documents. And it could, of course, greatly enhance our evidence. But for now, the papyri are extremely ancient. All right? And then here's a few more. We're gonna talk. There's P64 and P67, parts of Matthew, P46, most of the Pauline epistles, et cetera, et cetera. So that source is available on the PowerPoint. You can follow the hyperlink and look at it yourself later if you want. So, how many are there? 5,800 and counting Greek New Testament manuscripts. Now, one of that P46, that tiny little fragment with a couple of verses on it, that counts as one. All right? So you're saying, well, that's kind of cheap to count that as one. But the average length of the manuscript is 200 pages. Okay? So a lot of complete New Testaments and then some fragments. You average out somewhere in the middle. We have 125 papyri from the first 3 centuries. So the first 300 years after the time of Christ, we've got about 125 of those. That is very ancient, very close to the original, far closer than any other document from the ancient world. We've got 500 of them that are before AD 900. So you see how it works, right? It's on one of these kind of inclines. The further along in history you get, the more numerical, the more numerous they are. And that makes all the sense in the world for a couple of different reasons, right? Why would there be more copies later than earlier that survived? Why is it more likely that a copy from the 13th century survived than one from the 3rd? Better quality materials is part of it. It's 1,000 years less old. I mean, that helps, right? And of course, the further along in the history we go, the more monasteries, the more places are making copies, right? Because the church is much larger in the Middle Ages than it was in the late Roman Empire. So not only that makes all the sense in the world that we've got, that it's going to be like that, and I've got a chart coming that shows you that in a minute. The totality, 1.3 million pages of hand-copied Greek text in that 1,500-year span. And they are from all over the place. Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, Germany, everywhere. England later on, Palestine, they come from all over the place, all copied by hand. And here's the thing. That's a small amount of what was originally copied by hand. We have no way of knowing how much has been lost to history. It's a lot. But because, of course, they don't exist anymore, we don't know. Just thought of this in this moment. There are plays by Euripides. He was one of the guys on that list, right? There are plays by Euripides that we know that he wrote that no copies exist of. The only reason we know he wrote it is because a different author whose work did survive talks about that play of Euripides called whatever, and we have no idea what was in it. He wrote like 150 plays, and only a handful actually survived to the modern world. Okay? Thankfully, that's not the case with the Apostle Paul, right? That we've only got Galatians and 2 Timothy. And everything else he wrote, no. Nope, we got a lot. We have evidence that is overflowing. Now, it's not just Greek New Testament manuscripts, okay? Because there are also 10,000 of them in Latin. Because in the West, They started writing them in Latin fairly early. We'll learn when in a bit. And about 5,000 in other languages, Coptic, Syriac, etc. Okay, 5,800 in Greek, 10,000 in Latin, 5,000 in other languages. Of course, if it's in Latin or in Syriac or Coptic, then you have to take that extra step and say, is it an accurate translation, right? Because it's a translation, but that's still valuable evidence. Plus 1 million, give or take, quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers. Okay? These learned men of the church in those first several centuries quoted the New Testament about 1 million times. And those are useful. They're not more important than the manuscripts because, of course, these church fathers weren't always perfect at their remembrance either. They would quote Paul from Colossians, and actually the second half of their quote would be what he wrote from Galatians or whatever, right? Because, they were going from memory a lot. But they're quoting the New Testament all over the place. If there was this big controversial theological thing hidden, we'd have found it. It would be in the evidence, right? For example, pick something way out of the league so that if the New Testament had originally said that money is awesome and you should get as much as you can get and screw the poor people, right? If the New Testament originally said that, and then later on the church was like, that doesn't look good, we'll say something about being nice to the poor, right? If that's what it had originally said, it would be somewhere in one of these manuscripts somewhere, in a quotation from a church father. It would have been found, right? The archaeologist would have opened up the thing and started reading and going, whoa, whoa, whoa. This version of Matthew is completely different. Blessed are the meek. Ha! Right? I did that because, of course, other more consequential things people have their own passions about. But that's true of every topic you can think of. Now, each book of the New Testament has its own textual history. Okay? Revelation has the least number of extant. Extant means surviving. Manuscripts. And a significant number of variants. That's not that weird because, of course, Revelation's got some odd stuff in it that one would be prone to get wrong. It's got some interesting words and all of that. So if we're talking about how sure we are of the text being the original, Revelation is at the bottom of the pile, whereas Hebrews is at the top because we've got more copies of Hebrews and they have less variants in them. So as a whole, we're all within this range, but the different books of the Bible have a slightly different history than each other. Let's stop and look at some charts because charts are cool. So this is what survives, right? Not what was once made, but what has survived. 2nd century, we've got 4 papyri. Okay? 3rd century, we've got 47 papyri and 3 majuscules. That I'll show you what that means. It means they're writing in all capital letters. It's really annoying. 5th century, you see that the papyri starts to decline because that's not the main way it's being done. And then the majuscules are getting more numerous. And then they started with the green, with the minuscules. They said, forget this capital letters, big stuff. Let's do it tiny. And the lectionaries. Lectionaries, right? Those that belong to a liturgical church. Lectionaries got a lot of scripture in it, right? Because that's the readings for Sunday. And so those start to be quite prevalent. So you can see that curve, right, of being more numerous as time goes on. And once we get, of course, to the printing press, then the point's kind of moot. Here's a different way of looking at it. How much of each kind there is in each century, starting with the papyri that have survived and that declining over time because the book form became more prominent. I just thought those charts were useful because charts are cool. All right, let's get some conclusions about the manuscript evidence, and then we're going to actually look at some of these. Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic, his book is called Misquoting Jesus, and his book is all about how the New Testament changed the words of Jesus. But here's his quote: "Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variance in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." The resurrection, the virgin birth, right? The deity of Christ, none of these things, no essential thing that you are supposed to believe or do is in any way affected. And that's the skeptic saying it. All right? D.A. Carson is the opposite of a skeptic, but this is how he puts it. "Nothing we believe to be doctrinally true, nothing we are commanded to do, is in any way jeopardized by the variance. This is true for any textual tradition. The interpretation of individual passages may well be called into question, but never is a doctrine affected." So, for example, if there's a textual variant that in Ephesians, I'll just pick a random verse, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 7. Maybe there's a textual variant there, and we're not entirely sure. Maybe it's an 80, 20, 60, 40 as to what the original is. Guess what? That's not the only place that doctrine was discussed. That's not the only place we were told to do that thing. The important things are throughout the New Testament, throughout the scriptures as a whole, but especially throughout the New Testament, all right, again and again and again. If you remove one because you're not 100% sure about it, you haven't taken away the deity of Christ, you haven't taken away the resurrection, you haven't taken away salvation by faith, none of that, because it's everywhere. So let's look at some conclusions. None of the papyri discoveries of the past 135 years has resulted, and this is important, in a single new reading. All were already in the New Testament text tradition. So in the last 135 years, we have found a lot of these papyri that were hidden in the desert. Nobody has seen them for almost 2,000 years, right? 1900 years, depending on when they were found. When they studied them, in those papyri, they didn't find a single new reading. Everything that was in those fragmentary papyri that we were talking about is in the later copies from the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries and whatnot. Nothing was in there that was a mystery. That's pretty important. That tells us that what was written that anciently, 2nd century, 3rd century, is what was still being copied 1,000 years, 1,200 years later. Okay? It already existed. How many have we found in the last 10 years? I put this stat in 6 years ago. I haven't been able to find an updated stat, so, but it's about the same. They have cataloged about 70 new manuscripts in the last 10 years. About 1,800 pages worth of text. And this is continuing to happen. I'm trying to remember the acronym. It'll come to me in a minute. But basically, that's going to hurt my feelings when I think of it. Daniel Wallace's group, he's in the next quote, they're basically finding manuscripts that are in old libraries, old museums, old places, and digitally photographing them and cataloging them, ones that have never been cataloged before. All right? They continue to be found archaeologically and simply just bringing the evidence together. So that 5,800 number goes up every year by a couple more. And yet, not a single new reading has been found. It's all been in there somewhere. It's already there. Conclusions. This is a longer one. Daniel Wallace is a genius on this topic. He's one of the foremost authorities in the world. Though textual criticism cannot yet produce certainty about the exact working of the original, this uncertainty affects only about 2% of the text. And in that 2%, support always exists for what the original said. Never is one left with mere conjecture. In other words, it's not that only 90% of the original text exists in the extant Greek manuscripts, rather 110% exists. And so Wallace is saying what I said earlier, that original reading is always there somewhere. It's just a question of being 100% sure as to which one of the two or maybe three readings is the original. Textual criticism is not involved in reinventing the original. It's involved in discarding the spurious and burning the dross to get to the gold, to use the metaphor. Okay, so when these textual critics, and that's the correct term for his job, when they are looking at manuscripts, they are not saying, I wonder what John said in this next sentence. We don't have any evidence, we're just going to have to make it up. That never happens. Doesn't need to happen. The only thing is, we've got all of this evidence and we've got a variant here. All right, look at the evidence for this variant, look at the evidence for that variant. It really looks like it's this one, but we're not 100% sure. We're going to put the other one in the footnotes so that they can tell. And you can get, if you want it, a Greek New Testament that has this textual apparatus in it. Every time there is a variant that is viable and meaningful, it will tell you which manuscripts have which reading. All right, now of course you would have to learn about the value of P46 and P66 and all that stuff. You would have to learn about the codices because otherwise it's just, and it has a weird, they have these funky symbols for them as well. Instead of just putting their whole name of it. It's quite, I could show you my Greek New Testament. So here are my conclusions based on all of that. And these are not, these are historic facts. There's no disputing this. The Bible has much older copies, far more reliable copies, and many, and I could put more manys, more copies than any other ancient text. That's just a fact. Whether you are a Christian or not, that is a fact. Okay? An atheist, a Hindu, a Jew, a Muslim, if they're looking at the evidence, they're going to say the same thing. Because, of course, Bart Ehrman says the same thing, right? And Bart Ehrman gave up on his faith years and years ago. Older copies, more reliable copies, and a lot more of them. The accuracy of the New Testament text is not a matter of faith. It has been established by evidence and is in every meaningful way the same words as those of the original authors. That is the rub for the story of copying. I'm going to show you some of the text. We're going to talk about some of these manuscripts in a minute, but I want to stop and pause and see if we are all on the same page of understanding here. Questions? Plus, I needed some water. All right. This one is just useful. You can't really see it on here, and I couldn't print it big enough to be. Our copy machine doesn't have paper. Even the 11 by 17 is not big enough to read. But if you go on the computer and zoom in, then you can see this gentleman just put all of that information that I've been talking about on one chart. It's nice to have it all in one spot. Let's talk about the text. Before we start talking about the New Testament text, let's talk about the older text, of course, the Hebrew scriptures. And so we have to talk about the Septuagint. All right? This was from the 2nd century before Christ. It's also known as the LXX. It's the translation of the Hebrew into Greek, into Koine Greek, which was the common language of the people that the people spoke in the marketplace. And much, of course, of the ancient world spoke Greek at the time of Christ. Commissioned by Ptolemy II, using 70 Jewish scholars working in Alexandria, and it is older than any surviving Hebrew manuscripts. Okay, so we have copies of the Septuagint that are older than we have copies of the Hebrew that preceded it. And it was commonly utilized by the New Testament authors and church fathers when quoting the Old Testament. If you are enough of a nerd in Hebrew and Greek, you can tell when someone's quoting the Septuagint versus quoting the Hebrew, even though they're writing the whole thing in Greek. I can't, but they can. So this precedes the New Testament. This is actual size, and I like these because they're actual size. This is called the Nash Papyri. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll talk about that next, were discovered in 1947, this was the only portion of the Hebrew scripture older than the time of Christ. Not a lot, right? Because the Old Testament's longer than the New Testament. Hebrew text containing the Ten Commandments is what this is from Exodus. It's not actually the Hebrew text, but it's the Ten Commandments plus the Shema. We think that they were using this as for the people in synagogue, right? If you're the dude that doesn't have them memorized, you got the cheat sheet, right, for when they're doing the Nicene Creed or whatever, and you're just like pretending that you know it. That's what this was. It is it's the oldest, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, surviving Hebrew of the Old Testament. What about the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the most important archaeological finds in history. And that is a fact. More than the Ark, because we never did find it, Indiana Jones notwithstanding. They were created by the Essene Jewish community. There were separatist groups living out by the Dead Sea. They thought their culture was going to hell in a handbasket, and they said, we're out of here. And they went out to live by the desert. They made these copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it includes copies of every book of the Old Testament except for Esther and Song of Solomon. These were the fundamentalists of their day. Any guess why they didn't? Perhaps, because it could just be a weird coincidence that there's no Esther and Song of Solomon, but I'm guessing not. What's your guess as to why they didn't particularly want a copy of Esther or Song of Solomon?
Esther doesn't mention God.
Esther does not have the sacred name of God. It does not have the tetragrammaton, the Yahweh in it. You heard me say that before.
Song of Solomon's a little.
Song of Solomon is erotic poetry. And so, yeah, so they weren't included. But everything else is, along with 900 total documents, tens of thousands of fragments containing both sacred literature and everyday writings like grocery lists. Extremely important for understanding who the Essenes were, but a very important archaeological find, including the Great Isaiah Scroll, which, and this is why we don't talk about the Old Testament very much when we're talking about variance and accuracy. The text of the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is basically in the entire scroll of Isaiah, that was copied by the Essenes before the time of Christ and sat in that cave until 1947, is almost exactly the same as the Hebrew manuscripts that we have from 850 AD. Because the Hebrew scribes were crazy about accuracy. They did things which ordinary people would not do, like counting every letter in a line when they were done with each line to make sure that they had it right. All right? It was double checking and triple checking that they did with their scriptures, that the Christian scribes, frankly, were not all about that. All right? They had more professional scribes. They took it more seriously. And so it's just an incredible amount of accuracy. It's confirming, therefore, the extreme accuracy of the Old Testament copying process. There's 1,000 years between the Dead Sea Scrolls and our other oldest Hebrew manuscripts from the 9th century, and they're virtually identical. Okay? So that's why Bart Ehrman doesn't make a big deal about the Old Testament, because he knows they just were copying machines. Yeah. So that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls look like. That is one picture of a portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you can see that, of course, some pieces were those little tiny fragments. So imagine you're the archaeologist working in Israel once this was found, trying to figure out if this little piece belongs in this hole right here, all right? Knowing that they had giant piles of pieces that had fallen apart over the years. Not cool. This is a closer look, and something that you may or may not know is there are no dots here. It means there are no vowels. The vowels were not added until the Middle Ages. The original Hebrew manuscripts did not have vowels. It was just consonants. And you might say, that's kind of annoying. But they knew the text, right? The priests, the Levites, the Pharisees, and the like, they knew the text well enough that they didn't need the vowels. They put the vowels back in, the Masoretes did, in Europe, because they had the Jewish diaspora, right? Jews living in Poland and in Germany and in France and whatnot, and they were not as fluent in Hebrew as their ancestors because it wasn't their primary language, right? Because they were foreigners living in a strange land. And so the Masoretes went back in and said, we got to add the vowels to help people out here. I've got a copy of the Isaiah scroll. I just need to figure out what happened to it. Here it is. So this is the great Isaiah scroll. The only complete Dead Sea Scroll is Isaiah, 24 feet long. This is not, but this is one page of it. 11 inches high, 54 columns of text on 17 strips of leather sewn together. That's some work, putting that together, okay? This is, let's see, from right to left. So from here this way, because you read right to left in Hebrew, right? So this is Isaiah 52, and in the middle, Isaiah 54, and then Isaiah 55. So the fifth line down says, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed, right? The suffering servant is this passage, which is why, of course, they chose this one. First century BC, except for a couple of scribal errors, exactly the same as the one from the 9th century. So that's pretty incredible. Next, what happened to all the rest of those Hebrew manuscripts? The vast majority of them were destroyed when Jerusalem was destroyed. Most of the ancient Hebrew manuscripts predating the time of Christ were in the temple complex. And the Romans didn't go through when they were burning the place and destroying it all and say, oh, well, these documents are ancient. We should protect these, right? No, please. The soldiers, they burned the place down. All right? Very few manuscripts survived that cataclysm because it was so centralized, right? At the Council of Jamnia in AD 100, so about 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders there confirmed the Old Testament canon and said, these are the books that are part of the scriptures. It's the same as the one that we use. But this is what they did. When new copies of manuscripts were to be made, the old, worn out, or tattered would be buried or destroyed. Kind of like a flag, right? When the flag gets old, you've got to retire it the right way with the Boy Scouts and all of that. That's basically what they said. These scriptures are so sacred that when they start to wear out, they're in these scrolls, when they start to fall apart, you either bury them ceremonially or you burn them. And of course, the archaeologists and the historians are like, right? Don't do that. That's why we don't have any from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, because when they're worn out, they just destroyed them. But they made a new copy before they destroyed the old one, and seeing the Dead Sea Scrolls shows us how well they did. That 1,000-year gap. Until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, no Hebrew manuscript before 850 AD existed. So until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Hebrew scriptures had the same kind of gap as all of those other ancient documents, right? About 1,000 years or more. The Dead Sea Scrolls takes the date back about 1,050 years, more or less, closer to the original. Now there's still, again, when Moses was writing to the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's still a lot of time, right? But that's a lot better. Continuing to talk about the Hebrew text for a few minutes, this is the Aleppo Codex. I was talking about those later ones that we find, and you can look at this online. It's quite fascinating to look at. Here's the vowels. Okay? It's one of the reasons why learning Hebrew is no joke. Here's your vowels down below and the consonants up above. It's a mind bender. I did not enjoy it and didn't get very far. All right. Questions about the Hebrew text? All right.
Back to
Yep.
Septuagint.
Septuagint, yep.
Septuagint. Why is it named what it was named?
Okay, so Septuagint is Greek for 70. Because there were 70, supposed to be at least, this is a little bit legendary, 70 scholars that translated it into Greek. And the legend says that the 70 each did their own translation and then they got together and they were all the same. That's hogwash. They worked together as a team, right? Because it's a huge task, translating the whole Old Testament into Greek. But that's why they call it, because of these mythical 70 translators. So that's a Greek name for the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Does that make sense? And people pronounce that differently. Septuagint, Septuagint. How many syllables? I've heard it every way, so don't worry, either which way. We were talking about uncials before. All caps, no spaces. The first way of copying the New Testament was this way. What on earth? How you doing there? If that was English, you'd still be having a hard time, right? Spaces are nice. They help you tell when one word ends and the next one begins, right? So if you didn't know what the text was, that's really hard. But once you know that, oh, this is Ephesians 2, you can go, yep, if it was in English, because you'd know what you're looking for, right? But the original, and this is something I've made known to my Bible studies many a times, the original Greek New Testament has no punctuation. No quotation marks, no commas, no periods, no colons, no semicolons, no exclamation points, no question marks. Or is there anything else? No hyphens, no ampersands, none of that. That's not how they wrote. So anytime you are looking at punctuation in the New Testament, it is or the Old Testament, it is a translator's choice. So your red letter edition of the New Testament gospel of, when Jesus is talking, is somebody's best guess. That might not be Jesus talking. That might be John commenting on what Jesus said. And every once in a while that's significant. Most of the time it's no big deal. But keep in mind that Paul didn't necessarily mean you to stop where that period is. And Paul usually has about 8 commas in every sentence. So who knows? He's so much fun for them to try to figure out where to stop his sentences because the man doesn't know how to quit. Next, oops, I got another visual. Number 3, this is life size. We saw that on the chart. P46. It's called the Chester Beatty Papyri because Chester Beatty is the guy that bought it. The oldest substantial portions of the New Testament, of course, those tiny little fragments. This is the oldest that has a big chunk. Written in the 3rd century, 100 years earlier than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Those are 2 book forms that we'll look at next. The first of the 3 New Testament codices originally, so this had 110 leaves or 110 pages in it with the 4 Gospels in the book of Acts. 30 still exists. The rest didn't survive. That was the first book. The second one, which is what this is from, had 104 leaves with the letters of Paul in them. 85 out of 100, where was it? Out of 104 exists, so that's pretty good. The third contained Revelation, but only 10 pages survived. That issue with Revelation again. So this is the end of the book of Ephesians and the start of Galatians. If you could see it, it says pros Galatas, to the Galatians, right there. So if you want to look at these afterwards, you certainly can come up and take a look. No spaces, no punctuation. That's just how they rolled. Next, we switch to minuscule, which is kind of like cursive. Which starting in about 635 AD, they switched from the all caps, shouting at everyone, all caps, with that, and now we've got a much more flowing and lovely script going there. So let's take a look at a couple of the codices. We're in the home stretch. The first of which is Codex Vaticanus. And I have a copy of it here. Well, not a copy of it. There's only one of it. I actually have the exact same page that I found the visual online. I don't know how that happened. This is the oldest nearly complete copy of the Bible. Let me have what I have on here first, and then I'll go there. From about 350 AD, it's been in the Vatican Library, hence the name, since 1475. We don't know how it got there, but it was there. The librarian did a, what books do we have in our library list, and this was listed. It's the oldest nearly complete Bible manuscript, missing the pastoral epistles. So, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Revelation. But all the rest of it in the New Testament is there. And of course, it becomes important in our story in 1881 when we're talking about the modern translations. We'll get to that later. So let's take a look at this. This page contains the end of 2 Thessalonians and the beginning of Hebrews. So the colored part, in the blue and the green and the red and all of that, was added in the 10th century. Somebody was trying to fancy it up. The original scribe just did not have the colors on it. But there is a fascinating piece of history in this. Throughout its life, and this is something that happens with some of the manuscripts, later scribes looking at it, studying it, would sometimes in the margin write what they thought the correct reading was because of a variant. They'd put it in the margin. This right here. Okay? So what does that say? In the, I think it was supposed to be the 13th century. Yes, the 13th century, a monk, probably, most likely, was looking at this and saw that an earlier scribe had put a different reading there. And so he fixed it back to what he thought it was supposed to be and wrote these immortal words. Fool and knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it? So, 700 years after it was written, a scribe put something in the margin complaining about the other guy's changing of a word and put it back to what he thought the original was. That's, of course, a variant now. Right? Because he did that. But that is a important document for the history of our story. Dropping my stuff on the floor. Next, so that's 350 AD, a nearly complete Bible. A couple hundred years after the last portions of Revelation or whatever you're arguing the last book written was. Next is Codex Sinaiticus, and the word Sinai is in there, from about the same time period. Nobody knew about this except for the monks of St. Catherine's in the Sinai Peninsula until 1844. A man named Constantine von Tischendorf, who was the Indiana Jones of his generation, complete with some of the questionable moral choices. Constantine von Tischendorf went around the Middle East looking for evidence of the manuscripts. He did this because in his generation, where's number 6? There it is. In the 19th century, in Germany, the common belief of many of the university scholars was that the Greek New Testament copies that we had weren't old enough, and therefore the text wasn't very reliable. Because most of these old ones that we're talking about now, they didn't have then. They were still buried in the desert. Most of them have been found in the last 200 years or less, starting with Sinaiticus. So Constantine von Tischendorf went on his own quest. went to Cairo, went and found manuscripts, went on an expedition. He went to St. Catherine's in the Sinai. Of course, this is the Ottoman Empire, right? But this monastery had been there for 1,400 years at this point. They were on good terms with the Muslim rulers of that area. They stayed by themselves in the desert. And so they had this there. This is a life-size, what Codex Sinaiticus looks like. The original 730 leaves, because we got Old Testament and New Testament, 730 of them, contain the New Testament, the Old Testament, plus the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. These were two later writings of the early church that the monks must have really liked. They put it together with it. This page is Luke 24. Now, the fascinating thing about Codex Sinaiticus is that it does not have the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. And that's kind of weird. You're like, what happened to it? Constantine von Tischendorf left the monastery with Codex Sinaiticus in hand. And that's where the story gets weird, because he claimed that the monks had given it to him, when it was actually kind of an interlibrary loan thing. And it was supposed to go back. And so there is a interesting story, and you can Google this and read about Constantine von Tischendorf. But in that process, he said, when I arrived, the monks were burning the leaves from the beginning. They started with Genesis, and they had to start their fires. They were using it as kindling. And so he was basically saying, these guys didn't know what they had. They didn't care about it. That's why I took it from them. There's a problem. This is vellum. Vellum does not burn. You would not use vellum for kindling. It does not take a light easy because it's old animal skin. All right? It's just not paper. That's a bunch of hooey. Something happened to the first five. They got detached from the book somehow at some point in its 1,500-year history, but before Constantine found it. So take that with a grain of salt. He kind of was like Indiana Jones, except for this belongs in a museum was a little bit iffy with von Tischendorf. But he was out there finding manuscripts before anyone else was in the process of doing so. Since then, of course, many have been found that have added to our understanding of the text. The next one is Codex Alexandrinus. Do you see how they're named? This one was found in Alexandria from the 5th century, so not as old. And it uses the Septuagint in the Old Testament, not the Hebrew. It was brought by the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch, that was in his territory at the time, from Alexandria to Constantinople, and then given to Charles I of England as sort of a present. This one, Codex Ephraemi from the 5th century. And you're saying, there's an issue. This is a palimpsest, which is a word that does not work in English. That P doesn't belong there. Palimpsest. Originally containing the whole Bible in Greek. What survives is incomplete. But this is what happened in the 12th century. Ephraim the Syrian. Everybody's read Ephraim the Syrian, right? He's a real page-turner. But he was a big preacher in his day, and the things that he wrote and said people thought were the cat's meow. And so somebody scraped off, and this is because these writing materials were so valuable and expensive, they basically said, we've got enough copies of the Bible, and I'll scrape that off so I can write down what Ephraim the Syrian wrote. But that doesn't work with these documents after they're 700 years old. The ink can't be really scraped off. It's soaked in. And so this is what you get. This, with the more cursive style, is what they replaced it with. The block script is our old friend the original. Now, with a computer, it wouldn't be that hard to separate those two, right? Our old friend Konstantin von Tischendorf translated this with the naked eye. I'm getting a headache already just trying to put the one in front like that. It's like two of those. See, if you're old enough and you remember, we used to have to put these things on the overhead projector. You got two of them on top of each other, right? That's what this is. Fascinating thing is that it does not have the pericope adultery. John 7:53 to 8:11, the woman caught in adultery, is not included in this old Bible. But the long ending of Mark is. And we will talk about those two because those are the two most important textual variants. That will be on our last week when we hone in on those two. All right. Aside from the Greek, what was going on here? Well, the Bible was being translated into Coptic, right? The Copts, they are still there in Egypt to this day, although they've had a rough generation with a lot of persecution in the last few years. They were translating the New Testament into their language. The people of Syria were translating it into Syriac. And I have a visual there. Nope, not this one. Where did it go? Sorry, I need... These were in order. That's the wrong order. Sorry about that. I thought I had... Well, never mind. You're not getting that one because I can't find where it went. This is Syriac. Okay? This is an important manuscript for one reason. In the year 463, a deacon in the city of Amid by the name of John, this is Eastern Turkey now, but it was part of the Byzantine Empire at the time, well, soon to be, copied the first 5 books of the Old Testament in Syriac, and he did something that nobody earlier than him thought to do. He signed it with his name and wrote the date. Nobody else in these manuscripts was doing that. It would make our lives so much easier if they said Ralph from Rome in the year of our Lord 381, right? Because that would stop a lot of arguing about how old the manuscript is. So this is helpful because he wrote that down. And this is, of course, one of the early languages that the Bible is translated into, and being Syriac. Our last stop, and this is where we will end today, is with Jerome. And I've got a few visuals to add after this. This is the Latin Vulgate. They called it the Vulgate because Vulgate sounds like our word vulgar. Because when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, his critics said, "Oh, your Latin is so vulgar. It sounds like shopkeepers and shepherds. It's not the highfalutin Latin that Cicero and all of the famous Roman orators used." But that was the point. He translated it that way on purpose. All right? It was a direct translation from the Greek and Hebrew, and will become the primary text of the Western Church until the Reformation. One of the things that's happening as the Roman Empire is splintering is that the eastern half is retaining its Greek heritage, and the western half is embracing its Latin heritage. So in the eastern half of the empire, copies will still be made. Of course, Muslim armies will be coming soon to make that more difficult, but Greek copies will still be made in the East moving forward. But in the West, Spain, Italy, North Africa, and the rest of Western Europe, it's all going to be in Latin. The Greek copies are going to stop being made because the language of scholarship in the West is Latin. The monks, the scientists, the learned people are all conversing and writing in Latin. So the Greek copies in the West are going to dry up because that's not what is useful there. So our copying of Greek New Testament manuscripts after Jerome is going to shift primarily to the eastern half of the empire Constantinople, Alexandria, etc. So the Latin Vulgate will be the Bible of the West, England, France, Spain, etc., for more than 1,000 years. It is venerable in that sense. It was used by the church for many, many, many years, except for, of course, we're heading towards that Orthodox Catholic split that's going to come in our next slides next week. So let me show you some interesting examples of what we've got going on here. There's 8. Here's 7. Yep. Size is interesting thing. This is a visual. This is the earliest complete Latin Vulgate Bible. It's called Codex Amiatinus from 716 AD. So little less than 400, just over 300 years after Jerome translated the Bible, we've got a surviving Vulgate manuscript. 13 inches by 19 inches, 7 inches thick, and it weighs 75 pounds. Put that in your backpack and walk to school, all right? This is a serious book, all right? And it contains, within it, something fascinating called Nomina Sacra. Nomina Sacra. And these are here, right here. You see the DS with the line over it? There's another one right there. There's another one right there. That's for Deus, the name of God. They started in the Middle Ages abbreviating the names of God throughout their Bibles. God, Jesus, Christ, all of them. They had a shortened version with a line over it. I don't know why. That was their way of saying the name of God is cool and we want to mark it out. But that was something they started doing. This one has an interesting history. In the early 8th century, monks at 2 monasteries in northern England made 3 massive Bibles, one for each of their monasteries and one for Pope Gregory II. A man named Ceolfrid, the abbot, the monastery's abbot, left for Rome with his copy. But he died on the way there. It's not easy to go from northern England to Rome in the 8th century. He didn't make it there, and the copy, nobody knew what happened to it. It was actually at the Abbey of San Salvador of Monte Amiata in Tuscany. That's where they found it 1,000 years later in the 1780s. And nobody knew that it was that manuscript from northern England until someone studied it later and said, wait a minute, that manuscript, that Bible copy, that book that went missing, there it is. All right, this is the first page of Genesis. So in red, right, in principio, in the beginning. So you can see that it's still a fairly normal text, right? Not much embellishment. Well, that is about to change. Because in the Middle Ages, in the West, they're all Latin manuscripts, right? So there's no new work being done. It's just copying the old. So what do? You start with artistry. And sometimes with picture books. This is the Morgan Crusader Bible. It was commissioned by Louis IX of France in 1240 with just pictures. Because frankly, reading is a lot of work. And who wants to read, right? Basically what they did were make drawings of the life of David, but everybody in the drawings is from the 13th century. You've got knights on armored, knights with lances and whatnot, and basically he had them draw all the bloodiest pictures. David chopping off Goliath's head and all of these battle scenes, because that's what Louis IX really liked in his Bible. Read me more about heads chopping off, Mom, kind of thing. This has captions, though, because, we want to know what's going on. So a scribe added Latin captions. And then a cardinal from Poland, on behalf of the Pope, gave it to the Shah of Persia, who had Persian captions added. And then in the 18th century, in a Persian script using Hebrew letters. So it's got 3 different languages on it, captioning these bloody pictures of the life of David. This is the part where Saul is begging Samuel because he's been told he's not going to be king anymore. And here's David out with the sheep, just minding his own business, waiting to be king. So that is one thing that they did. We've got 2 more here. Big, big, big. Boom, right? This is the Winchester Bible. I should probably scooch more this way for Facebook. This is from England, Romanesque, 2 volumes. And then in 1948, they put it into 4 because it was too unwieldy. This text was copied by a single scribe. The whole Bible. That's a lot of work. But the illustrations were a whole bunch of different artists over many generations. You can see, look at all the artistry in the margins. All right, that's a lot of time and that's a lot of money because those pigments are not cheap. So this is commissioned by someone with some bucks. This is the first page of Genesis. So you got the same kind of thing right there in the beginning. So huge, giant illustrated Bibles in the Middle Ages. I've got 2 more and then we will wrap it up and pick it back up talking about translations next week. These are 2 of the fanciest ones. This is the Book of Kells. All right, if you're Irish, this is Ireland's most famous historical piece of art. All right, it's a medieval illuminated manuscript. This is just the cover page this is the Cairo page, actually, for the Gospel of Matthew. It doesn't actually have the text on it. This is just the artistic page in the front of it. From 800 AD, the decorations on this are so complicated that you can't see them without a magnifying glass. But no magnifying glass existed when the artist made them. I don't even know how they did it. Somebody with better eyesight than me for close-up work, that's for sure. So this is at Trinity College in Dublin. 500,000 people or more go to look at this on display every year. It's an amazing work of art. And so that's what they were doing in the late Middle Ages, art, because the scriptures were set, right? It was in Latin. We're just making them as beautiful as possible. And here's one more known as, and we'll end with this because it's going to be a good segue, as the Lindisfarne Gospel. Written and decorated in the 8th century by a single gifted artist, a man named Eadfrith, at a Benedictine monastery on a small island of Lindisfarne off the eastern coast of northern England. It's, of course, the Latin Vulgate because that's what everyone was doing. But 200 years after the book was created, this is just a Gospels, it's not the entire New Testament, a priest named Aldred inserted between the lines of Latin an Old English translation of the Gospels. It is the earliest known English translation of any portion of the Bible. So at about the year 1000 AD, that's not, these pages don't show that, this is just the fancy page. So Eadfrith, the artist, used 42 different colors and planned his designs by sketching them on the back of the vellum, the animal skin, and then holding them up to the light so that he could see what he had sketched. Pretty amazing. 42 different colors for the artist, but this is important, of course, because it's the very first surviving English portion of the Bible. And we will pick it up next week. We will talk about the Bible in English and how we got from there to here. So far, we're just talking about copies, right? Just copy, copy, copy. Greek, Hebrew, and then, of course, Latin, but that's it. We haven't been talking about English yet because we haven't got to the portion of the story where English exists as a language. We're just getting there. Questions?
I just wanted to see, are you saying that last one that you showed us, someone wrote in an original
Yes.
Latin version, they wrote English?
He wrote the Old English in between the lines. Kind of tiny, probably.
Yeah.
But yep. One of the monks from the monastery said, you know what, we could really use the English in there. Maybe he was trying to help out the monks whose Latin was not so good. Questions? And of course, you can come look at these visuals if you want after we're done. They're pretty fascinating.
Was that like 1000 AD when he wrote in the English?
Yeah. Yep. So about the same time as Norman the Conqueror, right? 1066. It's in that era. So it's a long time ago. But yeah, for the English language, that's very, very early. That's before Chaucer. That's before anything that we're going to be talking about. All right, well, thank you for coming. And we will pick it up next week with at about 1000 AD.